Okay, hello everyone. Welcome and thank you for being here today in another event of our colloquium series. And it's my pleasure to introduce Francisco Mujica. As many of you already know, he is a visiting scholar at the Phenomenology Research Center. And he has studied in Chile, but he has done research in different universities in Europe, in Belgium, Germany, and also in Argentina. And he has been a professor of social theory and sociology of law in Chile. His research mainly focuses on phenomenology and the links between social theory and idealism. The title of Francisco's talk is Heidegger's Thesis on Being. He will be presenting for around 45 minutes, and after that, we'll have time for Q&A. So I'll turn over to Francisco, and please help me welcome him in our gathering.
Thank you, Mujica. I'm quite happy to be here and honored to be part of the Molson Lectures, as I call it. I think it would be a pretty good name. Well, I'm glad because I thought we were just the 2 or 3 of us, but there's a lot of people here, so I'm honored. I want to be very schematic because it's a difficult and also controversial subject. How do I hit the space bar? Okay.
It wouldn't be this, maybe just hit this one.
Okay.
Trackpad.
Okay. So my presentation today, my conference about the Heidegger's thesis on being, a very obscure subject. And the main thing that I would like to address is that it has been often claimed by most famous Heidegger interpreters that the main thesis of being and time, the meaning of being, was never developed by Heidegger. As a matter of fact, some of them interpret being and time, and in some interviews and texts, Heidegger also said it himself, that being and time is a preliminary exercise in order to grasp being or the meaning of being. But it's my hypothesis, and that's why I prepared today, and I want to discuss with you, that the thesis of being and time is already being and time, moreover, namely in the fifth paragraph of being and time. So my main question is, if the thesis is there and everybody, or almost everybody, is saying that it's not there, why aren't we able to grasp it? And my hypothesis for this discussion with you is that we aren't able to grasp Heidegger's thesis on time because we should have like a dynamic concept of time, and most of the notions in philosophy tend to be static notions of time. That being said, I would like to reconstruct the main notions of time in philosophy, in the history of philosophy, in order to show that most of them have static aspects or features or structures. And then I will address like what would it mean like to have like a dynamic notion of time, and eventually that will help us to grasp Heidegger's notion on being, thesis on being. Certainly the first hypothesis, the first thesis on time, the first great thesis of time, we find it in Aristotle, namely his Physics, and more specifically in the 4th book of his Physics. Aristotle defines time with the following sentence: time orders movement in terms of before and after. Time is a distinction, furthermore, a scale that allows to quantify, to account things, also to name things in order, in words of Aristotle. Given that we know, we have this distinction that make us allow us to say this come first, this come after, to establish temporal sequences. We can name things. Given that time is the already established difference between before and after, it is what allows us to enunciate a thing, then another, then another, and then another. Nevertheless, this approach has not allowed us to identify a common ground in order to distinguish before from after. In other words, Aristotle's concept of time does not have a criterion to establish what the capital difference between before and after is. In this sense, we should raise the question on the essentiality of the before and the essentiality of the after, without a fundamental distinction that allows to differentiate the essence of the before and the essence of the after. There's no way to avoid a confusion between before and after. Time conceived as pure before would be like a dark cloud of uneventful events, and time conceived as a pure after would be like a chaotic measurement of uncontrollable events. Furthermore, the lack of a standpoint to distinguish before from after could lead to a pile of befores depending on the after, and to an atopic after that only exists after infinite afters. In order to resolve this problem, Aristotle would underline the constitutive function of the instant. That's why Aristotle writes in the fourth book of his Physics, time is both constant and divided by the instant. Instant separates and unifies time. Instant helps time to become the unity of difference that make what time is. This allows Aristotle to underline the fact that time is always becoming something else. In this sense, time is not only a measurable scale, but a homogeneous scale. Inner difference in time can only be quantitative once, never qualitative once. This is why time is a succession of any moment. This scheme that Aristotle offers us can be considered the first scientific or objectivistic notion of time that I know of. We, or I, could characterize this notion of time as a chronological abstraction of external movement. In this idea of time, we cannot describe the inner movement, the inner change of the objects involved in the chronological process. This is why it's a static notion of time. We cannot describe the qualitative changes implied in all movement. This is why it's an objectivistic notion of time. And finally, we cannot describe the role of subjectivity in time. We can go to another concept of time that take into account the subjective role, the role of subject in time. That's the notion of time that I found in Kant's Critique. Contrary to the objectivistic concept of time that dominated philosophy since Aristotle, Kant will establish that time can only be conceived in a subjectivistic way. Furthermore, time cannot be conceived as measurable. Time is not a scale. It can never be a scale because time is pure intuition. According to Kant, time does not belong to the world, but to the mind. Moreover, it is precisely because time is a pure intuition of subjectivity that the world becomes measurable. In this view, time is not a phenomenon, a representation, or a concept, but a condition of possibility of every experience of every phenomena. It is interesting to know that according to Kant, objects demand certain epistemic requirements in order to be constituted. Objects can only be experienced, constituted, represented as a consequence of a certain intellectual activities that dwell in the consciousness. To put another way, objects are, properly speaking, a construction that arises thanks to the pure intuitions of time and space, as well as the transcendental schemes, cause, succession, disjunction, synthesis, and so on, spontaneously produced by the subject. In this sense, the subject is not measured because of time, but time measured because of the subject. We can only perceive change because time is a pure intuition given as a priori to the subject. This is precisely why Kant concludes time is thus given a priori. Only in time the reality of phenomena becomes possible. All the phenomena may disappear, but time itself, as a universal condition of its possibility, cannot be suppressed. Even though Kant's concept of time takes into account the role of subjectivity, it is still a static notion of time, and this for two reasons. First, can never offer an answer concerning the genesis of time. Furthermore, he insists all through his critique that time and space are spontaneously produced by subjectivity. Fichte, as we will see in a minute, reflected on this problem in his Wissenschaftslehre. If a synthetic a priori judgment must be demonstrated, it's not really an a priori judgment. There must be thus a more fundamental principle. Wait, sorry. Yeah, well, we can go to Fichte. Let me say one thing. Well, and the second reason this is why static notion of time is the Kantian concept of time can be considered a static one, is because different times must be necessarily considered as a part of the same time. This may give rise to the question of where the individual experience of time is, according to Kant, the one and the same for every subject. Moreover, one could ask if this notion of time enables us to distinguish the qualitative change in the process of time, and furthermore, if the Kantian concept of time allows us to take into account the procedural dimension of time. Apparently, Kant's idea of time dooms us to a constant of time, according to which there's no such a thing as a progress, evolution, growth, or destiny. Let's see the reflection of Fichte on Kant's problem of the genetics of time. So I just said that if a scientific a priori judgment must be demonstrated, it's not really an a priori judgment, according to Fichte. There must be a more fundamental principle in the origin of thinking, a totally and unquestionable a priori judgment as a foundation of knowledge. Fichte calls this principle action. Consciousness is action because awareness implies necessarily self-awareness, and self-awareness equals to the experience of my self-awareness. Self-consciousness is an action and the product of the I, of the same I, a unity that is presupposed by a content within every fact and every act of consciousness. In this sense, philosophy found a new principle in the unity of action and consciousness. Furthermore, philosophy seems to find a dynamic principle in Fichte's Tathandlung. Given that knowledge is no longer a judgment, but an action, the reflection of knowledge equals to experience, to live. Knowledge itself, raison vivante, as a great Fichte's commentator, Bernard Bourgeois, put it. According to Fichte, we no longer have objects of knowledge, but in the very same act of our self-awareness, we are objects of knowledge. We transform them through action of reflection as much as we are transformed by them in the process of our reflection on them. Thinking is from now on an action, a living function, a living movement. Time is, according to Fichte, dynamic because thinking is pure dynamism. As far as I know, Fichte represents the only effort of a dynamic approach to time. However, in order to conceptualize this dynamic, Fichte turns to the I. It is the I that allows us to distinguish the object of knowledge. It is the I that transforms the object in awareness. It is the I that makes us self-aware of our awareness. And moreover, it is the I that explains this whole argument, an I that never changes. In other words, Fichte had to come out with an intellectual explanation of the alleged dynamism of time, and every explanation is a concept, and every concept is static. It is precisely because of this contradiction between a static and dynamic notion of time, between concept and movement, in Fichte's thinking, that Ortega y Gasset characterized Fichte as a heart-rending blind walker through the mountains of metaphysics. Sharply to be distinguished from the static Kant's theory of time is another theory of time that goes back to St. Augustine. Against any objectivistic or quantitative theory of time, Augustine discovered a unitary standpoint that allows us to experience time as a contrast. This unitary standpoint does not belong to nature, but to human spirit. In this view, time could be also considered, roughly speaking, the measure of a certain movement. Only this time is this measure made by our spirit in terms of recall, hope, and attention. In this sense, a great future is no more than a high hope of the future, and a distant past is no other than big memories. That being said, time is not so much a scale or an extension as it is a distension that is relative to the operation of the spirit, memory, hope, and attention. Time is then a distension of the spirit. For St. Augustine, that means that I wait for the future now, and at the same time, I remember my past now. We can understand Augustine's view of time as focused in the present. There's no such a thing as three temporalities, but three dimensions of time. That is the present of the past, the present of the present, and the present of the future. This domination of the present in Augustine's theory of time starts the qualitative approach of time, later revisited by Bergson, Husserl, and Minkowski, a kind of time in which the subject experiences the passage of time as an inner alteration and underlines the ontological difference between the public time of the world and the intimate time of the soul. Even though Augustine offers an explanation regarding the passage of time, his concept of time remains a static one. In this sense, the present can only be present by ceasing to be present. We have then in Augustine's theory of time, two times of presence, a constant and a transitory present. This is precisely why he wrote, "Your years are not more than a day." This time, the static notion of time seems to enchain our present to our present. This is why Husserl was interested in Augustine's theory of time. It's also a subjectivistic or qualitative approach to time. But in this time, Husserl will approach time in a holistic way. His focus will be the constitutive unity of the three dimensions of time highlighted by Augustine. Moreover, Husserl will ask himself, how come these three dimensions of time, past, present, and future, can become one? Husserl will address this problem by the means of two distinctions. First, he will establish that past can adopt two forms, as memories of what is no longer present, as pointed out by Augustine, but also as retention, as a sedimentation of my present experience. The present moment of this conference is only possible as present because of your retention of my argument and because of my retention of the element just intended. This is why Husserl preferred to speak not of time, but of time flow. And this is precisely why Husserl compares the link between past and present to a comet's tail. Given that the present is only possible because of retention, past and present form an inseparable unity that can only be described as a retentional comet. It is interesting to know that, according to Husserl, the same principle applies to the link between present and future. Nevertheless, this time, Husserl's distinction is between hope and pretension. According to Husserl, future is not only a possible representation of an upcoming situation, but also the words and sound that I should pronounce in order to complete this present sentence. Husserl's theory of time. In Husserl's theory of time, past, present, and future are no longer representation, but the never-ending continuity between past, present, and future expressed as a perpetual lived game of impressions, retentions, and pretensions. Even though the qualitative approach of time developed by Augustine and Husserl managed to solve some of the problems of the scientific approach of time proposed by Aristotle and Kant, there's still some shortness in Husserl's theory of time. To start, Husserl's concept of time seems to be a formalistic approach. That is, an approach in which we cannot find any content whatsoever. The actual memory, the specific recall is swallowed by the never-ending passage from impression to retention and to pretension. Furthermore, Husserl's notion of time remains a static one, given that Husserl does not take into account the internal movement, the inner change that always go together with the passage of time. This is why all impressions, all retentions, and all pretensions have the same output in Husserl's theory of time, even though it is obvious that not every impression, not every retention, and not every pretension have the same significance in my path. And the same principle applies for the entire scheme of impressions, retention, and pretension. Bergson saw the problem concerning the relation between past and present in Husserl's theory of time. That's the contribution of his concept of évolution créatrice, as well as Minkowski underlined the problem regarding the link between present and future in Husserl's concept of time, hence Minkowski's idea of avenir attendu. I would say that we have been able to show that the main concept of time, the history of philosophy, are static notions of time, namely because they fail to explain the inner change, the dynamism that always go together with the passage of time. I would say that we're now in a position to truly grasp Heidegger's thesis on being. Heidegger's philosophical project is to grasp being, given that the human being, the Dasein, is the only being that poses the question of being. Heidegger's hypothesis is that the question of being is necessarily linked to the question of time. The reason is simple. The Dasein is the only being that has a certain consciousness of time, namely of his finiteness. Temporality is therefore, according to Heidegger, the ultimate meaning of the Dasein's being. In order to grasp being, we need a certain being that is able to pose the question of being, and given that that being, Dasein, finds the ultimate meaning of its very existence in time, the question of being can only be posed in terms of time. But here lays Heidegger's dilemma. According to Heidegger, it is impossible to pose the question of being because Western thinking is dominated by the vulgar conception of time. In this conception, time is the capital tool to distinguish real phenomena, nature, existence, from ideal phenomena, number, statements, God. In this sense, time has been used traditionally and simultaneously to tell apart what is affected by time, as well as the different regions of being, an animated object, organism, individual, societies, and so forth. Nevertheless, nobody has been able to explain so far how and why time acquired such an important philosophical function. Nonetheless, if being must be approached in terms of time, it is not only because of the different regions of being, Seinde, as Heidegger puts it in German, that are possible thanks to time, but being itself. But why are we not capable of grasping being if we can perfectly grasp the different regions of being? Here comes the crucial point. We are not able to grasp being because we're not approaching time properly, because we still think time as a static reality. According to the vulgar notion of time, the regions of being signed are made visible because they are in time. This is exactly why we can say that cells have chemical requirements in order to be formed, or that a thunder and a ball of lightning are the same phenomena despite time difference. Note well, all these regions of being can be grasped because they are in time, but at the same time, they appear not to be touched, not to be affected by time and its operation. On the contrary, being is only made visible when we conceive time in a very different way. Heidegger states that being comes intelligible in their modifications and derivations through consideration of time. Now, a quite important consequence follows. Being has, according to Heidegger, several modifications and derivations, and if being only becomes intelligible through consideration of time, and if being has modification and derivations, that means that time, or rather temporal determinations, can affect being. Being is touched by time, and this is the reason why being becomes intelligible, and at the same time, the reason why being has modifications and derivations. In light of considerations such as this, we can understand Heidegger's need of approaching being through a dynamic notion of time. Time makes being comprehensible, but at the same time, time modifies being. But the fact is that being does not change. How to reconcile then the necessary change that make being visible and the necessity of being sign? Heidegger turns to Aristotle's metaphysics in order to answer this question. If we take a look at the classic concept of being, we can identify a static dimension, the statement, the linguistic determination, that is the concept. The concept does not move, the concept does not change. The concept is eternally what it is, identical to itself. But still more important that this static dimension of being is also, according to Aristotle, doing itself. Being is constantly and perpetually executing its own essence. Substance is a ceaseless subsistence, a ceaseless movement, a ceaseless struggle in order to keep being. every being is a ceaseless movement in order to make its substance visible. Aristotle calls this dimension of being energeia on, in other words, being as operating. It is precisely this notion of energeia on, being as operating, that will allow us to discover Heidegger's thesis on being. If the different regions of being, Seinde, as stated earlier, can only be because they are in time, being, Sein, can only be because of the difference that temporality introduces. The meaning of being becomes visible thanks to the different manifestations of time, particularly because of the difference that time establishes. Time allows being to become visible in different ways. And it is precisely this unique difference introduced by time that makes every being the exact being that is, and not a mere region of being. Contrary to the traditional interpretation of time as a static reality, Heidegger's thesis on being is only possible thanks to a dynamic notion of time. Moreover, Heidegger's concept of time is not only dynamic, it takes into account the inner transformation of temporality, but a genetic one. Time is the ontological difference that animates, that brings to life regions of being and allows them, strictly speaking, to be. In this view, one could say that time is like a divine breath that animates regions of being and allows them to be a being as operating in actu exercito. Thanks a lot. I'm here for this.
PowerPoint slide. Study this carefully.
Please.
Okay. So I guess I want to push back on your characterization of Husserl's conception of time as being.
Want to go back to the PowerPoint just to have all the evidence? Okay.
Okay. So I want to push back on your characterization of Husserl's conception of time as static, because he does earlier in the time consciousness lectures, he does talk about the now as a moment. But then he also talks about what he calls absolute subjectivity, or what you call the absolute flow. So there are things are unfolding in time for Husserl, but time is also a movement that's continuously unfolding within consciousness. So he says that there's an absolute flow, or a kind of absolute appearing that allows temporal objects to appear within it. And he thinks that that consciousness is able to coincide with itself or be united with itself across the flux of the becoming. So I would argue that that is not just static, because he doesn't just think time is happening as a series of instants. He thinks that there's the consciousness is able to encompass that difference within itself. And so when you talked about Heidegger having a dynamic understanding of time, I guess my question was, it seems like Husserl is speaking of time in terms of consciousness.
Yeah.
And he calls it time consciousness.
Yeah.
And Heidegger speaks about time in terms of Dasein.
In movement.
And so my question is, what is for you, if you're trying to push against this idea of Husserl and his concept of time, what is the role of Dasein in time for Heidegger? It seemed like that was, I don't know, is that something that you see as central to to the difference between Husserl and Heidegger regarding time? Or do you think it's just this difference between a static on the one hand?
And well, there's a lot of questions in your question. I will to address them all. To start, I would say that, and I'm not the only one that says this, I'm not considering myself an expert Heidegger, far from it. But I've known scholars that have studied Heidegger all their life, and I listened to them saying that Heidegger is not a fair interpreter. Like when he comments on other thinkers, he tends to uh, use them to prove his point, and so when he talks about time, even though in Being and Time he does not says that he's talking about Husserl, when he talks about the vulgar notion of time, I think he's addressing the distinction of logical investigation between real and ideal, and he kind of suggests that that concept that Husserl came up with in logical investigation have dominated in different forms or aspects the history of the philosophy of time, and I would say that's not fair because the theory of time in Husserl is much more richer than just that distinction of the logical investigations, and it's very nuanced, as you put it. I would accept that the concept of time in Husserl is not completely static one, precisely because we all are feeling our inner flow in every experience whatsoever. Yeah, but I would say that the concept of time in Husserl still have static features because of that, because given that it's a formalistic approach, it cannot explain why a traumatic event is a different kind of impression that a regular impression, to put it, like that was the point that I was making, So I would say that eventually, when you study the Husserlian theory of time, he describes the passage from present to past and to future, but for me, like it's just like a conceptual description. It's like there's no strength, there's no force, there's no major distinctions between, that was the point I was making. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
Yeah.
And to finish with your question regarding the function of Dasein in the project of grasping being in Heidegger's philosophy. Yeah, I would say that I thought I said that in page 7 of my conference. You have it there. When the argument is like given that the only being that can pose the question of being is a being that is partially conscious of his finiteness, the question of being, according to Heidegger, in my reading, should be posed in terms of time. No, sorry, page 6. Yeah. So I don't know. Did I answer the question?
Yeah. Yes, we should talk more about that.
Of course.
I agree with you that Husserl's descriptions are formal, at least in the when consciousness lectures.
Yeah, and I was using here the manuscript of Bernau, but I don't see that there's much different from the lectures of the inner consciousness.
Yeah, it seems that there's something in Heidegger, and I'm an expert at it, but there's something about the care structure in Heidegger that opens time.
Yeah.
That's why he has to then go back through in the second part of Being in Time.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's what allowed like to consider time as an static movement or kind of synchronicity. But yeah, you're right. But I was kind of afraid that we didn't have enough time to read. Oh, I wouldn't have enough time to read this, so I kind of focused on the project of grasping being and not the whole argument of being in time. But yeah, I think you're right. Yeah. Thank you for the question, though.
Thank you.
Page of your Aristotle's idea of an ideal. My question is about this, process of development toward becoming a substance or toward making the essence visible by a being. So how can this ontological attitude toward like being be grounded phenomenologically? How can it be grasped phenomenologically? How can we say? How can we describe this ontological, movement toward energia or toward this teleological movement from a phenomenological point of view?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. And I would say that Heidegger's method is not a phenomenological one in the Husserlian terms of, or the classic understanding of Husserlian. I think that your question is quite interesting because addresses, for a lot of reasons, but more in this case, because addresses like the turn that Heidegger introduces in phenomenology, and given that I would say that the analytical or the phenomenological description as a philosophical attitude is not enough to Heidegger in order to work in philosophy, but you will have to, how do I put it? Question yourself in an existential way, and that question will open the gate in order to do philosophy. Like the question of being is ultimately like a hermeneutical self-reflection on your situation and your place in history. That, from my point of view, connects you to history and makes you think about your destiny as a human being, as a Dasein, as a person, and that grounds the question in terms of time, in terms of temporality, more specifically. So yeah, I'm not quite fan of these scholarly discussions, but if I were pushed to answer that kind of question, I would say that Heidegger is no longer like a phenomenologist in the classical sense of the word. No, not at all. He changed the method, he changed the project, and yeah. And I would say that Husserl would agree with me, if I may say. Like I read some letters when he says that Heidegger took another path, and that's not longer phenomenology as I understand it. So first you have a question? Okay. Please.
When we talk about energia, it's a teleological concept, right? We have potentiality, potentiality. So if being is like temporally a structure, then how can we identify like this telos, this ideal toward which being is moving? I mean, doesn't it?
Well, in Heidegger's interpretations and Aristotle, as I read it, but I read it many years ago as a young student. I was 21, 22, so I don't remember. But I read it, but I don't remember that much. It's not as much as a theological thing, but an self-reference movement in order to make substance what substance is. In which sense?
But to make substance what it is teleologically.
But if substance had a teleology, it would have to become another thing. And the struggle is to remain being constantly what it is.
It's a conversation that acorn in the tree is already contained within the seed, so there's already the teleology contained in the seed. So the entire work is to work towards fulfilling your substance, the totality of your substance, which is already predetermined.
And then the
time becomes static.
Yes, that's it.
What becomes, sorry?
Like,
Oh.
if you are imposing the structure of essence.
Well, that's a question that Heidegger would have to answer, not me. If he reached out to Aristotle correctly or he was wrong, that's not my. I'm not in a place to say that. Yeah, yeah, it's a difficult thing, especially because, as you should all know, Aristotle Metaphysics is not a book, it's like a kind of different articles or drafts that were put together, and they tried to do their best. But the point that I would like to make in this is like the important thing is, for me, like in my reading of Heidegger, is to finally have a concept of time that can explain the inner movement, the transformation of the thing. But you're right, being never changes. Like being is not never changes, it's static. So how can you describe like a dynamic reality by static means? And that's why I think he looks up for this concept in Aristotle, that he allows them to explain movement and changing and become invisible and intelligible at the same time can be described by semantics and concepts, and that are static, of course. They're identical to themselves. Yeah. Thanks a lot. No, thank you.